My name is Natalie Bennett, and I am 37 years old now. When everything in my life began to unravel, when the foundation I thought was solid started quietly giving way beneath my feet, I was 35, married, raising a child, and completely unaware that the people closest to me had already begun rewriting my story without my consent. There was no explosion at the start, no screaming match, no dramatic confession. It began the way most real betrayals do, softly and visibly, with a feeling that something was wrong long before I had language for it. I lived in a two-story house I helped build with my own hands, not from blueprints to beams, but in the way people really build homes, painting walls, late at night, fixing leaky pipes, assembling furniture while balancing a toddler on one hip. My daughter Lily had just turned 6, and she was the brightest thing in my world. Loud, curious, endlessly hopeful. She believed pancakes could fix sadness, and that hugs were a form of medicine. Most days I believed her. My husband Daniel Bennett worked in marketing. On paper, he was successful, driven, admired. At home, though, he had changed in ways that were hard to pin down. At first, I told myself it was stress. Long hours, deadlines, the quiet exhaustion that creeps in when adulthood piles too much onto one person. I adjusted without complaint, took on more around the house, gave him space, set up his home office with soundproof panels and a new desk so he could work in peace. I wanted to be supportive. I wanted to be a good wife. But something felt off. Not loud enough to confront, just persistent enough to notice. It felt like walking into rooms moments after someone had left air-stale warmth gone. Daniel grew distant in subtle ways. His eyes no longer lit up when Lily ran into the room. His hugs felt obligatory. His "I love you" sounded rehearsed, polite, like something said out of habit rather than truth. Still, divorce never crossed my mind. I believed in working through rough seasons. I believed marriage meant staying even when things weren't easy. What I didn't know was that Daniel had already decided to leave. He just hadn't told me yet. The signs were small at first. His phone was always face down. Late-night client calls that carried a flirtatious tone he never used with me anymore. He started dressing differently, caring about his appearance in ways he hadn't in years. Full cologne and styled hair for grocery runs at night. When I mentioned it gently, he turned it back on me, said I was paranoid, insecure, controlling. I dropped it. I had no proof, and I didn't want to become someone who accused without evidence, especially with Lily watching everything. Then my older sister Brielle called. We had never been especially close as adults. She was 2 years older, always the self-appointed authority in my life, especially after our mother passed away. She stepped into that role so completely that it felt less like concern and more like supervision. When she moved out of state, we drifted. I thought it was mutual. So when she called me out of the blue and said she was just checking in, my stomach tightened immediately. The conversation stayed shallow for a few minutes before she asked how Daniel was doing. I gave my usual, vague answer, busy work. You know how it is. She hesitated, then asked, Has he mentioned anything about seeing someone? The air left the room. I asked her what she meant, and suddenly she backtracked, saying she shouldn't have brought it up, that it wasn't her place. But the damage was done. She knew something. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed every moment that hadn't made sense, the smiles Daniel reserved for his phone, the way he seemed happier away from home, the emotional absence I had been explaining away for months. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I wasn't ready to make it real. Instead, I watched. I listened. And 2 weeks later, without meaning to snoop, I found the truth sitting open on the dining table, Daniel's work laptop, a message thread, a woman named Alyssa, his coworker, younger, single, not explicit but intimate in a way that didn't belong to me anymore. Complaints about me. Inside jokes. Flirtation disguised as emotional understanding. I waited until Lily was asleep before I confronted him. He didn't deny it. He just looked tired and said, We're not working anymore, Natalie. We haven't been for a long time. And in that moment, before the lawyers, before the lies, before the courtrooms, I realized something far worse than cheating had already happened. I had been fighting alone for a marriage that had quietly ended without my consent. When Daniel said we weren't working, he didn't sound angry or defensive. That was the part that hurt the most. There was no guilt in his voice, no desperation to explain himself, no fear of losing me, just resignation, like he was closing a tab he'd already finished reading. I remember standing there in our bedroom, the light from the hallway spilling across the floor, thinking that whatever I said next might decide the rest of my life. I asked him if he was in love with her. He didn't answer right away. He just sighed, rubbed his face, and said, "Does it really matter?" That single sentence did more damage than any confession could have because it told me he'd emotionally left long before I ever had the chance to fight for us. The next morning, he packed a bag. Not angrily, not dramatically, calmly, efficiently, like someone who'd already rehearsed the moment. Lily was at school, thank God, because I don't think I could have survived watching her wave goodbye to a father who was choosing another life. He told me he wanted to keep things amicable, that he didn't want this to get ugly, that we should focus on what was best for Lily. I nodded because I was in shock and because part of me still believed that even if our marriage was over, our shared love for our daughter would protect us from becoming enemies. For a few weeks, it almost worked. We spoke politely. We coordinated schedules. We agreed to split custody evenly, or so I thought. I told myself this was just a painful transition, not a war. I focused on Lily, her routines, her school projects, her questions about why Daddy wasn't sleeping at home anymore. I answered carefully, never blaming Daniel, never letting my voice shake. I wanted to be the stable parent. I needed to be. Then the custody documents arrived. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in my hands, unopened, already uneasy. Something about the weight of it felt wrong. When I finally pulled the papers out and started reading, my vision blurred. Daniel wasn't asking for shared custody. He was asking for primary custody. Worse than that, he was claiming I was emotionally unstable, that I had controlling tendencies, that Lily wasn't safe with me during periods of stress. My hands started shaking as I flipped the pages, each accusation more surreal than the last. It was like reading a stranger's biography with my name slapped on top. And then I saw the list of potential witnesses. My breath caught when I read the first name. Brielle, my own sister. The woman who had called me weeks earlier under the pretense of concern. The woman who had planted the seed of suspicion and then disappeared. She hadn't just known about the affair, she had chosen a side. And it wasn't mine. I called her immediately. Straight to voicemail. I texted. Nothing. I drove to her place that weekend, heart pounding the entire way, half hoping I was wrong, half knowing I wasn't. She didn't answer the door. I could hear movement inside. I knew she was there, but she stayed silent while I stood on her porch, feeling like I'd been erased from my own family. That was when the rumors started. My father called, asking if I was okay. But the way he said it told me he'd already heard something. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly reached out with vague messages about hoping things settled down. People looked at me differently, cautiously, like I was unstable glass that might shatter if handled wrong. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. New apartment, new haircut, smiling photos with Lily posted online with captions about fresh starts and doing what's best for his daughter. I was drowning in legal fees forced into supervised visitation while the court evaluated concerns. I had never raised my voice at Daniel, never laid a hand on him, never hurt Lily. But his lawyers were sharp, confident, and armed with rehearsed narratives. Brielle testified that I'd always had emotional outbursts, that I could be unpredictable under pressure. She referenced moments from my teenage years, incidents taken wildly out of context, painted as patterns instead of isolated memories. The court believed her. I lost custody. I was ordered to pay alimony. My reputation crumbled. Even my job felt the impact HR called me, inciting third-party concerns. I wasn't fired, but the promotion I'd been working toward vanished overnight. Lily went from seeing me several times a week to once under supervision in a sterile room with plastic toys and a sign-in sheet. Every time she asked, "Why can't I come home, Mommy?" Something inside me broke a little more. Daniel had taken my marriage, my daughter's trust and stability, my sister, and my name. And I still didn't understand why. Was it just about starting fresh with Alyssa, or was there something deeper, darker driving this I didn't have answers yet? But 2 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the truth walked into my life wearing guilt and holding a folder. And everything changed. 2 years can change a person in ways time never advertises. By the time the truth came knocking, I was no longer the woman who believed patience and good intentions would save her. I was thinner, quieter, sharper around the edges, living a life reduced to survival routines and supervised smiles. I worked longer hours at a warehouse on the edge of town, kept my head down, paid alimony on time, attended court-ordered therapy like a criminal completing parole, and counted my life in Sundays, the only days I was allowed to see Lily without asking permission first. I had learned how to function without hope. That was the only way to stay sane. So when a man walked into the warehouse that afternoon asking for me by name, my first instinct wasn't curiosity, it was fear. He looked out of place, mid-30s, clean-cut, but tense eyes, darting like someone bracing for impact. When I stepped forward and said, "That's me," his shoulders sagged with relief, like he'd finally found the end of a maze. He introduced himself quietly. "My name is Mason," he said. "I was with Alyssa. I was with Daniel's ex." The world narrowed to a pinpoint. He didn't waste time. He handed me a thick manila folder and said words that still echo in my chest when I think about them. She rehearsed everything. I didn't open the folder right away. I didn't need to. The way his hands trembled, the way his voice cracked under the weight of what he was about to confess, told me this wasn't gossip or revenge. This was guilt finally finding air. He told me he'd found the documents hidden behind drywall in Alyssa's apartment while helping her move out. Scripts, notes, timed emotional cues, courtroom dialogue written like stage directions, things to say to the judge, things to say to Lily, things to say to my sister. My mouth went dry as I flipped through the pages. Use trembling voice. Pause before tears. If asked about control, bring up isolation. Make it sound unintentional. Brielle reference college incident. Emphasize fear. My name appeared over and over attached to actions I'd never taken, emotions I'd never felt, behaviors crafted to look real enough to destroy me. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't heartbreak spilling over into bad decisions. This was architecture, a blueprint for dismantling a human being. Mason sat across from me, rubbing his temples, apologizing over and over. He said he hadn't known at first. He believed her when she said I was unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. He said she'd made it sound like she was protecting Lily, like she was the hero in a tragedy. But then she started doing it to him, writing scripts about him practicing tears, planning exits. He saw himself in my story and realized too late that we were both props. "I'll testify," he said quietly. "Whatever you need. I just couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you." After he left, I sat in the warehouse break room for nearly half an hour, staring at the folder. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt something colder than rage settle into my bones, a realization so heavy it was almost peaceful. This had been happening for years. Moments I'd dismissed as awkward suddenly rearranged themselves in my memory. Daniel encouraging Brielle to stay with us to help out when Lily was younger. Casual jokes about my temper that landed wrong. Public corrections over trivial things said loudly enough for others to hear. I saw it now for what it was: foundation work. Slow narrative planting. Brick by brick, my image had been reshaped long before the marriage collapsed. And Brielle, my sister, who always needed to be right, needed to be morally superior, she'd been the perfect witness. She wanted to believe it. It justified every instinct she'd ever had to manage me, correct me, oversee my life. Alyssa hadn't forced her. She'd fed her. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the confirmation that my destruction hadn't been collateral damage. It had been the goal. I took the folder to my lawyer the next day. He listened carefully, flipped through the pages, nodded slowly, then said something that almost broke me again. "This is disturbing," he said, "but on its own it's not enough. We needed corroboration, forensic verification, witnesses willing to testify under oath. Otherwise, it was just paper, and paper could be dismissed." So I did the only thing left. I went to Brielle. It was raining when I knocked on her door. She didn't answer at first, or the second time. On the third knock, her voice came through the door, sharp with fear. "Natalie, go away." I told her I wasn't there to fight, just to talk. She opened the door a crack, eyes tired, guarded guilt, flickering behind pride. I held up the folder. "She wrote scripts," I said calmly. "For all of us, even you." Her face drained of color. I showed her the page with her name circled, notes about emotional delivery scribbled in the margins. She read it in silence, lips trembling, then whispered, "I didn't know." I told her she'd helped take my daughter, that she'd helped erase me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I asked her to testify, to tell the truth. She said she couldn't, that our father would never forgive her. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. She already lost me. She just hadn't accepted it yet. I left the folder with her. A week later, the court received a statement. Not a confession, but an admission of influence. It wasn't much, but it cracked the door open, and immediately the retaliation began. False reports, anonymous tips, investigations, a message sent loud and clear. They weren't done with me yet, but neither was I. Retaliation doesn't always arrive as an explosion. Sometimes it slips into your life disguised as paperwork, unanswered questions, and the quiet dread of waiting for another knock on the door. After Brielle's partial statement, the air around me changed. It felt charged, like something coiled and watching. I knew Alyssa wouldn't take even the smallest loss quietly. People like her never do. Control once threatened becomes an obsession. Within days, reports started coming in. Anonymous claims that I was drinking around Lily, that I'd been seen yelling in public, that I'd threatened Daniel's family. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than momentum. Child Protective Services showed up at my apartment twice. Both times I passed every check. The fridge was stocked. The apartment was clean. The records showed consistency. But the message was clear. She could still reach me, and she wanted me to remember it. What she didn't know was that I had already changed. The woman who had walked blindly into court years earlier, trusting that honesty would protect her, was gone. In her place was someone methodical, alert, and painfully aware of how narratives were built. I started documenting everything. Every call, every message, every interaction involving Lily. I learned which recordings were legal, which weren't, and how to store everything securely. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing for survival. Then Lily started asking questions. She was 8 by then, still young, but observant in ways adults often underestimate. During one supervised visit, while we were building a crooked tower out of plastic blocks, she looked up at me and asked, "Why does Daddy cry when he talks about you?" The question landed heavier than any accusation ever had. I told her sometimes adults cry when they're sad or confused. She nodded, thought for a moment, then added, "He says you're dangerous, but you don't feel dangerous." I smiled, even though my chest hurt. "I'm not," I said softly. A week later, I got a call that chilled me to the bone. It was late, almost midnight, when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer. On the other end was a young woman named Julia, a teaching assistant at Lily's school. Her voice was shaking. She apologized for calling so late, then said, "I don't know who else to tell, but something happened today with Lily." My heart stopped. Julia explained that Lily had been unusually quiet at school, withdrawn in a way that didn't match her personality. When Julia gently asked if everything was okay, Lily hesitated, then whispered something that made Julia's blood run cold. "Mommy said if I ever tell Mommy's secrets, Daddy will disappear like magic." Disappear like magic. The words echoed in my head long after the call ended. Julia went on to explain that Lily had also mentioned seeing a special doctor, someone who asked leading questions about whether I scared her, whether I got angry, whether I said mean things. There was no court order, no school referral, just a private therapist Daniel had chosen. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. Alyssa wasn't just trying to win in court anymore. She was trying to rewrite Lily's reality, planting fear, engineering memories, turning my child into evidence. It was a line you don't come back from, and she crossed it without hesitation. I called my lawyer first thing the next morning. He told me not to confront anyone, not yet. We needed to move carefully. He found the therapist's name within days and confirmed what I already suspected: this wasn't a neutral professional. This was someone with a history of siding with whichever parent paid the bills. We prepared subpoenas. We requested a court-appointed evaluator. Quietly, deliberately, we built the scaffolding of a case that could no longer be dismissed as bitterness. I also reached back out to Mason. He didn't want to get involved again. He told me he was trying to rebuild his life, put everything behind him. But when I told him about Lily, about the coaching, about the threat wrapped in a fairy tale, he didn't hesitate. "I'll testify," he said. "I should have done more sooner. I won't stay quiet now." Then came the hardest call of all. I asked Brielle to meet me. Neutral ground. A coffee shop halfway between our homes. She arrived late, eyes wary, hands shaking as she wrapped them around her cup. I didn't soften it for her. I told her Alyssa was now manipulating Lily, that she was using the same techniques, the same scripts, the same emotional coercion she'd used on all of us. I slid the subpoena papers across the table and said, "You helped start this. Now you can help stop it." She stared at the papers for a long time before nodding. "I'll testify," she said quietly, "all of it." For the first time in years, I felt something close to hope. We scheduled depositions. Julia agreed to give a sworn statement. Mason prepared his affidavit. Brielle worked with my lawyer to amend her testimony fully. I organized the recordings, the emails, the scripts, the timelines. Everything aligned into a narrative so clear it was almost frightening. Alyssa sensed it. I know she did. Because a few nights before the emergency hearing, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. Lily wasn't with her. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wild. She told me I didn't know what I was starting, that I was going to ruin her life. I told her she already ruined mine. When she threatened to accuse me again, to flip the story, to destroy me one last time, I looked her in the eye and said something I'd never said before. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." She flinched. The next morning, we walked into court. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't alone. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered. Warmer, too, like the kind of place that pretends nothing terrible has ever happened within its walls. 2 years earlier, I had walked into this building believing truth would be enough. I'd left stripped of my credibility, my motherhood reduced to scheduled hours under fluorescent lights. This time I walked in differently. Not angry, not desperate, focused. I carried a folder thick with evidence, but more importantly, I carried clarity. I finally understood what I was up against, and understanding is power. Daniel was already seated when I arrived. His posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at me, not once. Alyssa sat beside him, composed in the way people are when they believe the story will still bend in their favor. She wore the same calm mask she'd perfected years ago, the one that said victim without ever needing to speak. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed it again. But I did know better, and so did the people sitting behind me now. Mason testified first. His voice shook at the beginning, not from uncertainty, but from shame. He told the court how he'd believed Alyssa's stories, how she'd painted me as unstable, dangerous, someone to be feared. Then he explained how he found the scripts, how they weren't emotional journals or scattered notes, but structured documents, timed pauses, emotional cues, rehearsed phrases. When he described finding the page labeled with Brielle's name, I saw Daniel's jaw tighten. He still didn't look at me. Then Brielle took the stand. Seeing my sister walk toward the witness chair was harder than anything else that day. Harder than hearing my character dissected, harder than reliving the worst moments of my life. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. When she spoke, her voice was steady at first, but it wavered as she went on. She admitted Alyssa had guided her testimony, reminded her of specific incidents, suggested how to frame memories that had never felt dangerous until they were reframed that way. She said she'd convinced herself she was protecting Lily. She said she hadn't realized how deeply she'd been manipulated until she saw the scripts with her own eyes. I didn't feel vindicated listening to her. I felt tired. Blood doesn't mean loyalty, and learning that had been one of the most painful lessons of my life. Julia's testimony followed, and the room shifted. She spoke softly, but clearly recounting Lily's fear, the exact words my daughter had used, the way she'd shrunk into herself when talking about what she was allowed to say. When Julia repeated the phrase, "disappear like magic," the judge's pen stopped moving. That silence was louder than any objection. Then came the recordings. My lawyer played them one by one. Lily's voice small but unmistakable, explaining rules she shouldn't have known existed. Statements about smiling too much, about not drawing my house, about loving both parents being confusing. Each clip landed like a hammer, breaking apart the narrative Alyssa had so carefully constructed. This wasn't a mother protecting her child. This was psychological conditioning. Daniel finally looked at me then. Not with anger, not with apology, with fear. The judge leaned back in her chair, reviewing notes, reviewing evidence, reviewing years of damage in real time. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but sharp. She said this case showed a pattern of manipulation that went beyond custody disputes, that the emotional well-being of a child had been compromised to maintain control. She ordered an immediate custody reevaluation, reduced Alyssa's access pending a full psychological assessment, and authorized a forensic review of the original case. It wasn't final, but it was the beginning of the end. Alyssa didn't say a word as we left the courtroom. Her lawyer whispered urgently to her, but she looked past him, already recalculating. I knew she wasn't done. People like her never are. They don't collapse loudly. They implode quietly, dragging as much with them as they can on the way down. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry, either. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the heater rattle, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything permanently, about how easily truth can be buried when lies are rehearsed well enough, and about how much further Alyssa might be willing to go now that her control was slipping. I was right to be cautious, because the next move she made didn't target me directly. She went after Lily. The call came late at night, the kind that jolts you awake before the phone even finishes ringing. It was my lawyer, his voice measured, but urgent, telling me there had been a development. Alyssa had filed an emergency motion of her own, claiming Lily was showing signs of emotional distress after spending time with me. The timing wasn't subtle. It never was with her. This was retaliation, pure and simple, but retaliation sharpened by desperation. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was trying to regain control, and Lily was the lever. Within days, I learned just how far Alyssa was willing to go. The private therapist, Dr. Janice Rowe, submitted preliminary notes to the court. They were filled with language that made my stomach churn. Leading questions presented as observations. Conclusions dressed up as concern. Phrases like fear response and avoidant attachment used without context, without balance, without any acknowledgement of the dozens of recordings and testimonies already submitted. It was a script in clinical font, and I recognized it instantly. Alyssa hadn't changed tactics. She'd just swapped costumes. The worst part wasn't reading the report. It was watching Lily react to the pressure she was under. During our next visit, she was quieter than usual, her laughter hesitant, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enjoy herself. When I asked her if everything was okay, she shrugged and said, "Mom says if I talk too much, people get confused." Confused. Such a careful word for a child to use. Such an adult word. It told me everything I needed to know. That night, I sat on my couch, surrounded by folders, recordings, and notes, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't about custody percentages or legal victories anymore. This was about protecting my daughter's sense of reality. Alyssa was trying to teach Lily that truth was dangerous, that love was conditional, that silence was safety. I couldn't allow that to take root. Not ever. So I changed my approach. Instead of reacting, I organized. I built a timeline. So detailed it bordered on obsessive charting. Every claim Alyssa made against the evidence that contradicted it. I worked with my lawyer to prepare a request for an emergency custody modification on the grounds of psychological abuse, not alienation abuse. Words matter in court, and this time we used the right ones. We subpoenaed Dr. Rowe's full records, not summaries, not interpretations, but raw session notes and communications. What came back confirmed what we suspected. Emails between Alyssa and the therapist discussing narrative consistency. Requests to avoid positive framing of Lily's time with me. One line in particular made my lawyer swear under his breath, "Mother requests that father's influence not be portrayed as emotionally safe as it complicates progress." Progress toward what? I also reached out to the school counselor quietly, carefully. With documentation. With concern, not accusation. She listened, reviewed the materials, and agreed something wasn't right. Julia's earlier statement was added to the file, reinforced by observations from other staff who had noticed Lily's sudden anxiety around speaking freely. Slowly, the picture sharpened. Alyssa wasn't protecting a child. She was manufacturing fear. The night before the emergency hearing, Alyssa showed up at my apartment again. This time, she didn't knock. She pounded on the door hard enough that my neighbor cracked his door open to look. I stepped outside before she could escalate it further. She looked unraveled eyes, wild voice, shaking anger bleeding through every word. She accused me of poisoning Lily, against her, of manipulating the court, of trying to erase her as a mother. I listened without interrupting because there was nothing left to argue. When she finally ran out of words, I said quietly, "You crossed a line when you involved my child." She laughed then, sharp and hollow. "You don't get to decide where the line is." I looked at her and felt something settle inside me, something cold and resolute. "The court does," I said. "And this time, they're watching." The emergency hearing was scheduled for 48 hours later. I didn't sleep much in those 2 days. I kept thinking about Lily's voice, about the careful way she chose her words, about the way fear can be taught as easily as language. I promised myself that no matter what happened next, I would not let Alyssa turn my daughter into a character in her story again. By the time we walked back into that courtroom, I wasn't hoping anymore. I was ready. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived without drama, which felt almost wrong given the weight of what was about to happen. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself who I was: grounded, present, awake. I carried my evidence in a single organized folder. No loose papers, no chaos. Control wasn't about dominance anymore. It was about precision. By the time I walked into the courthouse, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me, the kind that comes when fear has finally exhausted itself. The courtroom filled quickly. Daniel sat beside Alyssa, his face pale, his posture stiff. He looked smaller than I remembered, like someone who had followed a script for so long he no longer knew what to do when it was taken away. Alyssa, on the other hand, wore confidence like armor. She whispered to her lawyer, nodded at intervals, performed steadiness with practiced ease. If someone had walked in cold without context, they might have believed her again. That was the danger. That was always the danger. My lawyer opened with the motion for emergency custody modification, his voice measured and relentless. He didn't rush. He laid out the pattern step by step, starting with the original custody ruling and the testimony that supported it. Then he introduced the scripts, not as a shocking reveal, but as evidence in a larger narrative of manipulation. Mason's affidavit followed detailed and specific outlining how Alyssa rehearsed emotional performances, coached witnesses, and rehearsed courtroom responses as if preparing for a play. The judge listened closely occasionally, asking clarifying questions. She wasn't reacting emotionally, she was evaluating. Brielle took the stand next. I didn't look at her while she walked up. I didn't need to. I could hear the strain in her breathing, the effort it took to keep her voice steady. This time, she didn't hedge. She admitted that Alyssa had shaped her testimony, reminded her of incidents, suggested interpretations, and encouraged emotional emphasis where none had existed before. She acknowledged that she had allowed her need to feel morally right to override her responsibility to tell the truth. When she finished, the room felt heavier, like the air itself had absorbed the confession. Then came Julia. She wasn't supposed to testify that day. Technically, she was a late addition, but the judge allowed it after a brief recess. Julia spoke with quiet urgency, explaining what she'd observed at school. The fear in Lily's behavior, the exact phrasing Lily had used. When she repeated the words, "disappear like magic," the judge stopped her mid-sentence and asked her to repeat them again slowly. The silence that followed was absolute. You could feel the shift. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was harm. My lawyer then played the recordings. Hearing Lily's voice in that courtroom nearly broke me, but I held still. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. Her words were simple, innocent, devastating. Statements about not being allowed to smile too much, about loving both parents being confusing, about rules she didn't understand but obeyed anyway. Each clip stripped away another layer of Alyssa's narrative until there was nothing left to hide behind. Even Daniel looked down. Then his hands clenched, his jaw tight. The final blow came from the subpoenaed records. Dr. Rowe's full session notes told a story no professional should ever have written. Leading language, predetermined conclusions, emails discussing narrative consistency, and one line that changed everything Mother requested, that positive experiences with Father not be explored, as this would interfere with therapeutic goals. The judge read it twice before setting the papers down carefully, like they were something sharp. When she spoke, her voice was calm but unmistakably firm. She said the court was looking at a sustained pattern of psychological manipulation, not just between parents, but involving a minor child. She said the original custody ruling would be formally reviewed. She ordered immediate joint custody with a strong presumption toward primary placement, with me pending further evaluation. Alyssa's visitation would be supervised. A full psychological assessment was mandated, and a formal inquiry into perjury and obstruction was authorized. It wasn't applause-worthy, it wasn't cinematic. It was justice delivered quietly, finally. Alyssa didn't react, not visibly. But I saw it in her eyes, the calculation failing the realization that the room no longer belonged to her. Daniel stood slowly when the hearing ended, looking like someone waking from a long, disorienting dream. He didn't speak to me. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said under oath. As I left the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd won, but because the truth had survived. Lily's reality had been protected. The lie had been exposed, and for the first time since this began, I knew with certainty that Alyssa's control was broken. The fallout would come next, but the war was over. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly in official envelopes and quiet phone calls in shifts so subtle they felt unreal after years of chaos. 2 weeks after the hearing, Alyssa lost her job. No announcement, no public spectacle, just an internal decision made after her former coworker submitted evidence to the company's ethics department. A voice memo, a handful of emails, enough to make her a liability. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Accountability isn't loud when it's real. Then came the subpoena. The district attorney's office took over without asking me to do a thing. Charges followed: obstruction, false testimony, child endangerment. Alyssa pleaded down to a lesser offense, probation, and mandated therapy. But the judge's warning was unmistakable. One more attempt to weaponize the court. One more effort to manipulate a child, and she would lose every privilege she'd abused. I wasn't there for that part. I was home making pancakes with Lily, letting whipped cream towers collapse into laughter. That was the real victory. Lily moved back in with me gradually. At first weekends, then weekdays, then full weeks. That felt like breathing after being underwater. The court-appointed therapist said she was resilient, that she adjusted faster than expected when fear was removed from the equation. She feels safe here, the therapist told me. Safe. The word settled into my chest and stayed there. Lily began drawing again. My house reappeared in her pictures, then me beside her, then a crooked sun overhead. Her teacher framed one of them and sent it home in a folder marked "Keep Forever." Brielle posted a public statement about being misled and working toward accountability. I didn't respond. Some bridges don't need burning. They just need distance. Daniel faded into the background of our lives, quieter now. Careful, supervised. He never apologized. He didn't have to for me to move on. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you build when the noise finally stops. Months passed. The routine solidified. Thursday movie nights, Saturday pancakes, Sunday hikes with hot cocoa. Lily laughed freely again, loud, unguarded laughter that didn't check for permission first. One night while we were playing cards on the living room floor, she said, "Mommy, I think people tell stories when they're scared." I smiled and nodded because she was right. She always had been. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the manila folder, the script's the beginning of everything. I thought about destroying it. Instead, I sealed it in plastic and locked it away. Not out of fear, as a reminder. Truth doesn't need spectacle. It needs patience, evidence, and the courage to wait for the right moment. I didn't get my old life back. I built a better one. Because the people who try to erase you always forget one thing: when someone survives being falsely destroyed, they don't need revenge. They become proof that lies don't last forever and that done right is justice.